From the Historyogi podcast, this is Dave. In 1965, Singapore separated from Malaysia, shattering the hope of a shared post-colonial future. The new country needed as many friends as it could get. The man who led the effort to secure Singapore's place on the global stage was S. Rajaratnam, our first foreign minister. Today, we speak to Irene Ng, author of The Lion's Roar, which is the second of a two-part biography on Rajaratnam. While he is best known for drafting the National Pledge, Rajaratnam also helped establish Singapore's foreign policy principles and tackled some of the country's major challenges during the early years. In this episode, we discuss the execution of Indonesian Marines for the MacDonald House bombings, the settling of Japan's blood debt for wartime atrocities, the crisis after the Vietnamese occupation of Cambodia, Rajaratnam's views on multiracialism and national identity, and the PAP Old Guard's collective efforts to build Singapore. Thanks very much, Irene, for joining me today. To start off, how did you become S. Rajaratnam's biographer?
Thanks, Dev, for that question. Well, I had known Rajaratnam since my days as a journalist, and I had interviewed him in the 1980s and 1990s, both at his home in Chancery Lane and in his office as well. But of course, writing his biography was the last thing on my mind at that time. But those encounters gave me a sense of the kind of man that he was. His thinking, his values, his mannerisms. And I was struck during my interactions with him by his humanity, his humility, and his intense passion and love for Singapore. As you know, he played a central role in shaping some founding values and ideals of the country, and many of them remain relevant today. He was his first culture minister, his first foreign minister, the country's chief ideologue. He was the visionary leader who drafted the National Pledge and who envisioned Singapore becoming a global city at a time when globalization was not even a term that was invented at the time. And he was a constant source of strategy and ideas for Singapore's survival. So having listened to him, having followed his speeches, for me, I find it hard not to be inspired by him. But even then, at the time as a journalist, I didn't think, of course, of writing a biography on him. I was just interested in his ideas. And perhaps in a way, my personal background played a part in it. I was a former Malaysian. I knew how it felt like to live in a race-dominated system. I had felt the repercussions of having to make my way through a political and social system that was based on communal politics. And I did not take the Singapore system for granted. So I also admired the fact that there were people like Mr. S. Rajaratnam and his colleagues who fought for their vision of a Singaporean Singapore, a nation that's based on justice and equality, regardless of race, language, or religion, and fought for this vision despite all the setbacks and the challenges throughout the years. So I started thinking of writing Mr. Rajaratnam's biography in 2004. By that time, he was suffering from dementia. And that saddened me, of course. But what made me even sadder was the knowledge that very few people remembered him, much less knew of his struggles for Singapore or what he stood for or what he fought for all his life. So my decision to write his biography, and I officially started on his biography in January 2005.
The Lion's Roar features many sources that are being publicly revealed for the first time, such as cabinet records. Could you explain the various types of sources you used in your book and the process of obtaining access to them?
Well, first, I think it's important to understand the starting point of this biography as I conceived it. I wanted it to be a detailed and authoritative account of his life, work, and legacy, and to be as comprehensive as possible because it is the first biography of this founding leader. It must also have a strong narrative, and it must provide some sense of the human character behind the public face. So I bore in mind that Mr. Rajaratnam was not just any founding leader. In fact, he was one of the top three, the core team. And there's no doubt that he was one of the handful who changed the course of the country's history. So I felt a great responsibility if I were to embark on this project to make sure that I have a full grasp of his life, not only his public life, but also his private life as far as possible, and to access as many materials as possible to paint a full picture of him. So I did not set out to write a book about a great man. I made it very clear to my mind. I wanted to write a book about what made the man great, how he reacted when he found himself having to face unexpected challenges and dangers, how he improvised and adapted in the shadows, and how he coped when the darkness closed in, and above all, how he overcame. So to weave this compelling and authoritative narrative that I had hoped to do when I first started out, I needed an acute understanding of his world, his challenges, and his turning points, not only in his public life, but also his private one. And for that, I needed the support of his estate and the government, and access to his private papers, as well as relevant government papers. So when I began researching for the book, as I mentioned earlier, Rajaratnam was already suffering from dementia. So I sought the permission of his trustees to go into his house and to look into his boxes and boxes of private papers that were gathering dust in the shelves and on the floor. And I sorted through the personal papers, looked through his files, his notebooks, photographs, and drew from them for my narrative. I also asked the government for access to his cabinet papers and the relevant government papers. For that, I sought the permission of then the senior minister Lee Kuan Yew, the former Prime Minister of Singapore. That was in 2004. At the outset, even before I embarked on the project, I sought his permission for access to government papers, and this permission continued under his political successes for the second volume. It was important for me to understand the range of his contributions, because Rajaratnam was a man who's not given to self-publicity or promotion. In fact, given a man who's known for his writing skills and his fame as a journalist, it's remarkable that he never considered writing his own memoirs. But this is because he is a man of great discretion. And because he's a man of great discretion, the only way I could understand his real contributions to policy was to look at these papers. And this is how I explained it. And Mr. S.R. Nathan, who was then the president of Singapore, and who happened to be one of the three trustees of Mr. Rajaratnam's estate, also facilitated my access to papers in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, MFA. He was once MFA's permanent secretary, serving Mr. Rajaratnam himself, and Mr. Nathan needed no convincing of the need to document Mr. Rajaratnam's contributions in foreign policy. I was allowed access to these papers with the understanding that citations be vetted for national security. So this was the understanding we entered into. And I'm glad to say that nothing has been redacted from the body of this work in the process. It must also be made clear that no government official or leader tried to exercise any sort of control over the line that I'm taking, over my narrative, over my interpretation. And I think this is very important for me to stress. Nobody tried to steer me in any particular direction. So I was and am the biographer of Rajaratnam. So the biography is my work based on my interpretation of the man and what I read about the man.
When Rajaratnam became foreign minister upon independence in 1965, what were some immediate challenges he faced, and what did he prioritize?
Well, Mr. Rajaratnam had to contend with many grave geopolitical threats, and this was on top of the difficult problems of ensuring Singapore's survival and starting a new foreign ministry from scratch. But to understand what he was up against as Singapore's first foreign minister, I think it's important to get into what it was like at that time. I mean, there was the threat of instigated riots. There was a threat of conflict and invasion and occupation by unfriendly powers around Singapore. And these threats constantly hung over him. And one has to remember the exceptional circumstances of Singapore's independence and its high geopolitical anxiety at separation from Malaysia. And to remember that at the time, Singapore had no resources other than its population of less than 2 million. Unemployment was over 14%. Trade with Malaysia and Indonesia was Singapore's lifeblood. Yet upon separation, Singapore's relations with both its immediate neighbors were very tense. And, merely months before separation. And this was a phrase that Mr. Rajaratnam never allowed himself to forget. There were several Malaysian ministers, including Malaysian Minister Tan Siew Sin, who said that Singapore could not exist by itself. And as you know, Singapore had no defense of its own at the time. It relied mainly on the British and to a lesser extent, the Australian and New Zealand troops. Yet it occupied a strategic position in a region that had become a Cold War battleground between the two great powers, the Soviet Union and the United States and their allies. So it was a great time of uncertainty and also trauma, I would say, for Mr. Rajaratnam. Yet, to his credit, he managed to keep his cool. He was measured in his responses at the time when asked to formulate Singapore's foreign policy, literally on the fly. So many challenges. But if I had to summarize his key challenge, it was to avoid conflict, to make as many friends as possible, and to minimize unfriendly powers, to manage relations in such a way as to give Singapore a chance for survival. And that's actually was a very tall order, because that has to include securing international recognition for Singapore at the time when some quarters were dismissing it as a phony independence and a neo-colonialist plot. And there was quarters that also seek to down Singapore. And he had a great challenge to develop a non-aligned image for Singapore because it had British bases on its soil. And he had to also appeal to Afro-Asian sentiments because the Afro-Asian bloc made up half of the UN at the time. So they were an influential group. And all this need to build new ties, to establish a certain image of Singapore was crucial at that point, because in the event of an attack by a larger power, which was, of course, the great existential danger that Singapore faced at its most vulnerable moments, in the event of an attack, invasion, Mr. Rajaratnam could then hopefully rally world opinion to Singapore's side, especially that of the non-aligned nations. So Raja's role as its first foreign minister was pivotal and critical to securing Singapore's survival right from the infant stage.
The execution of 2 Indonesian Marines in 1968 for the MacDonald House bombing is considered Singapore's first foreign policy crisis. In your book, you revealed for the first time that Rajaratnam disagreed with Lee Kuan Yew's stance that the Marines should be executed. Why did Rajaratnam disagree with Lee on this?
As I mentioned in my earlier reply, Mr. Rajaratnam's guiding principle in the first few years, especially in the first few years when it had no defense and were building up its strategy to ensure Singapore's survival, was do not provoke. Try to manage relations, try to ensure order and stability so that Singapore can have a chance of survival, and maximize the number of friends, minimize the number of enemies. That was his guiding principle. So when faced with the appeal from the Indonesians to commute the sentences for the 2 Indonesian Marines who were sentenced to death for their role in the confrontation hostilities, Mr. Rajaratnam argued for a sense of give and take, in the sense that he recognized that at the time, Indonesia was itself changing. We must remember that for many years, especially the years preceding Singapore's independence, as Indonesia was mounting a confrontation against Malaysia. And Singapore suffered the brunt of it in terms of trade especially. And so after separation, Rajaratnam was anxious to try and mend as many fences as possible. He did not want Singapore to be caught in a state where you have a Malaysia which is unfriendly and Indonesia which is also unfriendly. Then you'll be isolated in a region which is unstable and which will not help Singapore to survive, much less progress. And he also recognized that this issue of the execution of the Marines is actually a legacy of confrontation. It happened during the Malaysia years. So the bombing of the MacDonald House was in March 1965. And in fact, many of the Indonesians who mounted hostilities during the confrontation, many of them have been sentenced and their sentences have been carried out, but they all involved injuries, not deaths. So Singapore had, based on some appeals by the Indonesian government, had acceded to their appeals to commute their sentences. These are for Indonesians who conducted in confrontation activities which did not involve death. So Rajaratnam bore that in mind. And he also bore in mind the fact that Singapore needed to look forward and hopefully start afresh with Indonesia as an independent Singapore, which is no longer a part of Malaysia. At the same time, bearing in mind that the Suharto regime has just come into power and is trying to establish itself as a moderate force, as opposed to Sukarno, which is openly hostile. So Raja saw an opportunity for a reset in relations. Now, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, of course, also was very concerned with Singapore's survival and security. But his own reading was that the Indonesians did not place much store on the issue of the hanging of the Marines, because according to his reading, because President Suharto himself did not make the appeal, it was actually Foreign Minister Adam Malik that made the appeal to Mr. Rajaratnam to commute the sentences. So therefore, the signal that Mr. Lee Kuan Yew received was that it's not that important an issue to the Indonesians. And Mr. Lee Kuan Yew also made the point that it's important at that stage to make clear to every country, including Indonesia, that Singapore had his own rules and everyone has to abide by its rules equally. And that was a point that Mr. Lee felt strongly about, because he did not want Singapore to be seen as subservient to any larger power. Of course, Mr. Rajaratnam also did not want to see Singapore subservient to any power, but he was realistic in understanding that in relations with Indonesia, which he thought that the Indonesian leaders were an emotional people, and therefore you should bear that in mind. And he's anticipated that there would be reprisals. He anticipated there would be economic blowback, and indeed all that was borne out after the execution of the 2 Marines. And I have to say that it was Singapore's first foreign policy crisis, not because of the hanging itself, but because of the aftermath. It was the reaction of the Indonesians. The hanging itself, Mr. Rajaratnam and Mr. Lee, in fact, had made plans to make sure that it's done quietly. There will be no loss of face to the Indonesian government. There would be a total blackout of news. And if that's been allowed to go forward as it was, there would have been no crisis. But to the dismay of the Singapore government, all these attempts at face management were shot to pieces when at the 11th hour, President Suharto followed up with a clemency appeal that was announced by the Indonesians publicly. And making matters even more complicated, the Malaysian Prime Minister Tunku Abdul Rahman also jumped in to support Suharto's appeal. So what started out as an internal matter of criminal justice suddenly became a highly politicized diplomatic issue involving the nation's sovereignty and international credibility. So as Rajaratnam himself said, with this development, there's no other option for Singapore but to stand very firm on its principles, because if Singapore commuted the sentences of the 2 Marines in response to such overt external pressure, this would give the impression to the world that Singapore's sovereignty had been qualified by pressure by its neighbours. And instead of a relationship of equals, it would then be one of the small deferring to the big. So as Rajaratnam said, to quote him, for us it became the first test of Singapore's foreign policy. If the city-state were to oblige Suharto's public appeal by tampering with its legal process as a gesture of friendship, then people would say, Suharto can give us instructions. And other countries would also pressure Singapore by saying, well, you have done it for Indonesia, what about us? So given the circumstances, Singapore had no choice but to take a stand, said Rajaratnam. Otherwise, we thought there'd be no end to these kind of pressures. As he described it, the decision to go ahead with the executions was made merely to make quite clear that Singapore, despite its small size, could be its own master where its national interests and law are concerned. And he also noticed that around the same period when the Marines were hanged in Singapore, Indonesia also executed 5 communist terrorists taking part in the Indonesia's abortive coup in 1965. And he said, you've got to treat us as an independent country, concede to us the same rights that you request for yourself. Otherwise, relationships become very difficult. So it became a huge diplomatic crisis that involves not only a battle of words, the military became quite belligerent, mounting Navy maneuvers near Singapore waters. The Singapore diplomat in Jakarta, Mr. Rahman, had death threats. The Indonesians mobbed the Jakarta mission. Their lives were in danger. And that was the first time that Singapore's mission in a foreign country was sacked and burned down. So it was a very serious issue which could have easily escalated into an outright conflict had it not been for Mr. Rajaratnam's moderate style, and I would say his wisdom in managing the whole episode. And credit must also go to his counterpart, the Foreign Minister Adam Malik, who tried to tamp down the shrill cries for an invasion of Singapore from many quarters, especially the military in Indonesia.
Rajaratnam also worked to resolve another sensitive matter, settling the blood debt issue with Japan over wartime atrocities. Could you explain how he negotiated a settlement acceptable to all parties, given the need to balance the Chinese community's anger with Singapore's desire to cultivate Japanese ties for investments?
Now, this blood debt issue is another long-standing issue with another major power, but it's also a legacy from the past. And this was a legacy from the British colonial days. The Singapore demands for the Japanese blood debt was to atone for the wartime atrocities committed by the Japan's military when it occupied Singapore from 1942 to 1945. So it was that long ago. But it was an outstanding matter that needed to be resolved for relations to move forward. And as I said earlier, Rajaratnam's priority at the time was to mend as many fences as possible and to make as many friends as possible, to open up as many channels for trade and economic cooperation as possible. And but it was still a highly charged issue in 1965. You must remember that Singapore has a majority of ethnic Chinese, and many of them feel a strong bond to China at the point, especially the Chinese educated, and many have painful memories of the Japanese massacre that's linked to Operation Sukching. In fact, PM Lee himself at one point had a direct encounter with it and narrowly escaped from Sukching, which started in March 1962, which is a massacre. And there were, over the years, there were discoveries of mass graves in various parts of the island, so that there was a great unhappiness and resentment that was building up, and there was a campaign by the Chinese groups to demand a 50 million blood debt. But of course, the Japanese insisted that all claims had been settled with the post-war British administration, so nothing to do with the Singapore government. It's all been settled. But the Chinese in Singapore still remembered and was very clear that this is something they would not let go and forget. So they harped on the 15 million blood debt. And PM Lee was very sensitive to the Chinese ground. So in mid-1966, Rajaratnam took over the negotiations, because previously all negotiations that PM Lee was involved in just led to a deadlock. I mean, didn't get anywhere. But I think Rajaratnam, given his sense of history as well as his sense of the future, because he could see that Japan was a Pacific power at that point, and to engage it at that point was an important geopolitical necessity. So he wrote a cabinet paper, which was revealed for the first time in my book, to inform his colleagues of the Japanese ambassador's proposal to reopen the matter on this basis. And the basis is that the discussions would be at the government-to-government level, So you're not going to talk to the Chinese campaign groups on the ground. It's going to be government to government. So it'll be rational, hopefully, and fair. And there would be no publicity. So it wouldn't be hijacked by emotion. I mean, that's the idea. So there'll be no publicity. And Singapore would submit proposals on how the atonement should be made. So in other words, it's in Singapore's court. So Rajaratnam took it upon himself to set the terms. So when he met his counterpart, the Japanese Foreign Minister Etsusa Buroshina, in October 1966, he basically, first of all, disarmed the Japanese Foreign Minister by giving a worldview, as he usually would, about the conflicts in the world and how the political divisions within Asia would remain for a long time to come, and therefore any effort to seek to remove these political differences as a first step to cooperation was doomed to end in failure, he told his counterpart. And so for this reason, he told the Japanese minister Singapore wanted to develop cooperation in economic and cultural fields so that all the different ideologies will not come into play. And then they begin to broach the topic of the Japanese blood debt. Now, it's important to know how Rajaratnam approached it. He approached it in the context of, yes, there are political differences. Yes, there will be political conflicts in the world for a long time to come. But now we have this problem in front of us, and therefore let's approach it with an eye on the future, on the long term. So he says that, so he told the Japanese counterpart very frankly that Singapore was primarily concerned with the future. Then he came the regretful but. But unfortunately, he said, the blood debt issue was one which could not be simply discarded because over the course of public debates in pre-independence days, the figure that they arrived at was 50 million. And he said that this being an emotional problem between the people of Singapore and in which the domestic politics of Singapore was an important factor, Mr. Rajaratnam proposed that the 50 million figure be strictly maintained, but to resolve the issue, it be split with half as a grant of 25 million and the other half as a loan. So it's a compromise. So in other words, the optics is that we're sticking to the 50 million. So it's important to the Chinese majority in Singapore. We're sticking to 50 million, but in terms of the mechanics of it, 25, half will be in loan and half will be a grant. And the Chinese minister was very happy with that, because it was a concession of sorts, although on paper, it's still 50 million. So it was a give and take, which Rajaratnam was very good at, but at the same time maintaining the principle that this was an agreed sum. So his handling of the whole episode was instructive in the sense that he could have lectured his Japanese counterpart on the brutalities of the Japanese. It must be very tempting to say, how you're such brutal people. You subjugated Singaporeans to such horror and atrocity, and therefore you have to pay 50 million, or else, that could be one approach. And you can see several foreign ministers in the world today taking such an approach and reminding people of their brutal history and then being cold to them. But Rajaratnam, putting Singapore's interests and long-term interests first and foremost in his mind, sought to take a different position, a position that's based on the long-term good of both countries and also for the region. So he chose to look forward. And of course, once the news came out, the Chinese groups were less than happy. And Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, at the time the PM, helped to manage the Chinese ground. And between the two of them, Mr. Lee and Mr. Rajaratnam, they managed to smooth over the feathers, and Mr. Rajaratnam kept the agreement alive long enough for it to gain credibility in the eyes of Singaporeans. At the end, the Chinese groups in Singapore supported it, understood where the Singapore government was coming from, and upon signing the agreement, the Japanese looked at Singapore in a different way. It's so did the world, because the signal that Singapore sent to the world is that it is a rational country. It is prepared to look forward, even though the past may not be one that's a friendly one between the different powers. And in the case of Japan, after that, there was a slew of investments that came into Singapore as arising from that agreement, which really placed Singapore in a good position to progress in the years following that.
Rajaratnam's leadership in handling the Kampuchean crisis during the 1970s and 1980s is well known. You mentioned one particular moment in 1979 when he clashed with the legendary Cuban leader Fidel Castro over the status of the Vietnamese-installed Cambodian government within the non-aligned movement. What principles was he trying to emphasize, and why did he consider it important for Singapore to take this stand?
Now, I'm not sure whether his leadership role, in fact, was well known in the saga. And it's only through my research that I found that he played such a frontline role in ASEAN in rallying the grouping into a united front opposing Vietnam's invasion of Cambodia and to internationalize the conflict through the UN. Even his role in Havana at the NAM conference was not very well known, I think. It was just a few lines by a few diplomats in some of their accounts. But I delved into it, and I hope that people who read it can get a sense of the drama of the moment and also the strong principles and convictions that basically underscored his battle that took about a decade of his life. So you ask about the high point, as it were, because it was a dramatic moment with Fidel Castro at the NAM conference. Now, what happened was Castro wanted to maneuver the non-aligned movement into the Soviet orbit and seat the Heng Samrin regime, which were Vietnam-backed, as the legitimate representative. And of course, this was something that Mr. Rajaratnam and his ASEAN colleagues had to fight against, because once that happened, if Fidel Castro managed to seat the Heng Samrin regime as a legitimate representative in NAM, it would have repercussions at the UN and to their battle to repel the Vietnamese case that it had a legitimate reason and it was accepted for it to invade Cambodia and to occupy Cambodia with its own government. So what Castro did was he locked out the Khmer Rouge delegation from the conference and he left the seat empty. Now, Mr. Rajaratnam had no love for the Khmer Rouge. In fact, he called the Pol Pot a butcher and a barbarian. But he was also conscious that in an imperfect world, sometimes one had to work with whoever one could find so as to avert a greater evil. And at that point, the Khmer Rouge delegation still represented the legitimate government of Cambodia before they were overthrown by the Vietnamese-backed regime. So the principle was clear as far as Rajaratnam was concerned. You cannot, just because you don't like a government in a neighboring country, go over and take over the country, throw out the government, and then put your own government in charge. So for Rajaratnam, it's a very clear existential threat. It's a very clear principle. No foreign power can interfere in the internal affairs of another government, and no foreign power can invade and occupy a country just because you don't like the government that's in charge. It's for him a principle that should be upheld in the international system, or else it'll be anarchy. So based on that principle, therefore his battle at the UN and at NAM with Castro, who wanted to assert himself as a third world champion. He was really an iconic symbol at the time. But Rajaratnam held firm and he really fought back truly like a Singapore lion. And Singapore diplomats that were there, including foreign diplomats, because I read their dispatches to confirm exactly what happened. And the dispatches from Yugoslavia, from America, from various countries confirmed that Rajaratnam played a critical role in beating back Castro's attempts to seat the Heng Samrin regime, which is backed by the Vietnamese forces at the conference. And therefore, had it not been for Raja, things have turned out differently. And from that, the whole battle by ASEAN to keep the issue alive at the UN and to win support for its case that Vietnamese occupation and invasion of Cambodia was against international norms. So that was an important episode. But at the same time, I would say that it also showed Rajaratnam's fighting spirit, his never say die spirit, because he was quite isolated at some points. At that time, there were only 2 other ASEAN countries involved in NAM, Indonesia and Malaysia. Indonesia was on the retreat because it was also under pressure over the East Timor issue. And Castro knew well enough to squeeze on that. And Malaysia was also under a bit of pressure. But Singapore, being very small, could have just kept quiet. But Rajaratnam felt strongly about the issue and he fought tooth and nail until the very end. And he did not manage to make sure that the Khmer Rouge delegation occupied the seat, but he kept out the Heng Samrin regime from taking over the seat. So the seat was declared empty. Not the best solution, but it's not the worst. And because of that, the next UN sitting, India, which was sympathetic towards the Vietnamese and Russia, also wanted to use the NAM example to declare the seat, the Cambodian seat in the UN empty. But Singapore also played a leading role in fighting back and managed just to make sure that the Khmer Rouge regime maintained that seat on behalf of Democratic Cambodia. They call it Democratic Cambodia, so it's a Democratic Cambodia seat. But that episode also taught Raja a lesson, as in made him even more acutely aware that it's not a sustainable position, because it was a very bad order that Khmer Rouge emitted in the international scene. You know, everybody knew about their brutality, and how can you support such a regime? You know, nobody wanted to be associated with them. In fact, for many years, Raja refused to even meet the Khmer Rouge leaders, much less deal with them. So what Raja did with the support of some in ASEAN was to hammer out a coalition which involves not only the Khmer Rouge leaders but also the Son Sann forces, as well as Prince Sihanouk's group, so that it will balance out and present a more credible and acceptable coalition to the world. And after that, it was the Democratic Cambodia was represented not by Pol Pot regime, not by that face that are so detested by many, but by Prince Sihanouk and his coalition, which involved as well the Son Sann group as well as the Khmer Rouge group. And for many years, they managed to sustain the support of the UN based on the coalition system, the scheme that was put forward at the UN. And that was a credit to Singapore's diplomacy, but also to ASEAN, who managed to work together, all the ASEAN ministers, despite their occasional ups and downs.
Rajaratnam championed a secular, all-encompassing Singaporean identity and was deeply suspicious of anything that could be perceived as promoting a communal approach. You write that he opposed ethnic self-help groups, the GRC system, and special assistance plan schools. Why did he insist on a Singaporean Singapore identity, and what were his beliefs on multiracialism?
That's an excellent question, Dev. I think first of all, we have to understand that this vision that he had for a non-communal, multiracial nation based on justice and equality, regardless of race, language, or religion. I mean, this vision and this belief is rooted deep in his character, in his belief system. It is not for him merely a policy. It's not merely something that he plucked out of the air because it sounds good, or he saw it being done elsewhere. In fact, it was quite a rare thing to try and pursue this path when all around Singapore, especially Malaysia, Indonesia, they were communal based. So it's rooted in his belief system because he was an unusual character right from the start. As a child, if you read Singapore Lion, my first volume, he interacted in school with people outside his race. I mean, his best friends were an Indonesian Chinese and a Japanese. He goes swimming with them. He loves reading. He loved reading. He loved reading all kinds of books from fantasy, to science fiction, to literature and the classics and philosophy. So his mind is open to different influences, and he formed his own judgments based on what he believed made sense. Now, he grew up in a very religious and quite a tightly bound community. His parents were very devout Hindus, but he broke away based on his own convictions of what it meant to be a good human being. And for him, a good human being, a good society, a good nation, a good world, is born out of an appreciation of difference. And not only an appreciation, but to be able to overcome those differences. So he learned that most dramatically in London when he was, of course, a minority. In fact, he was a minority all his life, to be honest. In Malaysia, he was a minority, he's a Jaffna Tamil. In Singapore, he was a minority. In London, he was a minority. But he made his own way. And he looked at people not based on their skin color, the cut of his nose, the shape of his eyes, as he liked to say, but based on their character and their values and what they stood for. And because of his love of books, in London, he went to a book launch, and it was by a man who wrote a book, Half Caste, where he made the case that everybody has mixed blood. If you trace back long enough, there's no such thing as pure blood. And that was to him a real revelation, because he was brought up by a community, which is Jaffna Tamils, who believed in caste, who believed in marrying within the caste and marrying within the community, and exposed to various relatives who frowned on those who married even outside the religion. But if you look at Raja's own actions in London, he married Piroshka Feher, who was, of course, non-Hindu. She was in fact a Lutheran, who is non-Jaffna Tamil. She was a Hungarian, and she was definitely not in the caste, the high caste that Rajaratnam was from. She worked as an au pair in London, escaping from the fascists in Hungary, her homeland. So when you understand his background, his influences, how he made his decisions and choices early in life, then you can see that when he became a culture minister, it's just being himself, true to his convictions, when he espoused and championed the vision of a nation regardless of race, language, or religion. And in fact, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, who was the Prime Minister in 1959, himself admitted that this was something that he would not have thought possible, this vision. But he says Rajaratnam championed it, and so I went along. He already said it publicly, so I just acquiesced, So it was Rajaratnam that framed it right from the beginning. So in 1963, when he joined Malaysia, you can see that same struggle. It's completely consistent with his lifelong conviction when he fought for Malaysian Malaysia. It's just something that he felt he had to do because he felt it was right. Just was on his side. Right was on his side. But of course, the experiment failed. Malaysian Malaysia, as we know, it ended up with expulsion of Singapore from Malaysia. And so he spent the rest of his life in Singapore trying to prove that the Singapore's vision of a non-communal nation is not only viable and sustainable, but is one that can be an inspiration to everyone else who have the same problems. And therefore, having invested his entire life to prove this and succeeding to a great extent, because as a minority standing in a Chinese educated majority ward in Kampung Glam, he managed to win every election in which he stood in. And not only that, there were walkovers after a certain point. In fact, there were so many walkovers that everybody knew that there's no point even talking about it because he's such a strong minister in his own right. And that says a lot for the fact that Singaporean voters could look beyond his skin color and vote him in based on who he is and was as a leader. So Rajaratnam had this conviction, you see, based on experience, that people could see beyond him as a so-called Jaffna Tamil, look beyond his identification on his NRIC as an Indian, although he was not Indian, and accept him and support him as a leader. So when it came to the GRC system or the ethnic self-help groups or the special assistance plan schools. The premise that he viscerally rebelled against was the view that people are still communal in their thinking, that you have to bear in mind communal sentiments, for instance. And that's why there were self-help groups, because Mr. Lee Kuan Yew believed that people of the same race or from the same community would help each other more readily than people from outside their race. That was a conception that Rajaratnam didn't accept, based, as I said, on his own experience and his own belief. And similarly for the GRC system, where the justification was the minority candidates have a tougher chance of getting in on their own merit, because people tend to vote according to their race, is another premise that Rajaratnam refused to accept on its face value. Although he recognized, he was realistic enough to know that Singapore still had a long way to go in terms of getting people to completely be blind to the divisions of race, language, or religion. He was realistic, but he felt this one was an ideal that needs to be reinforced day to day. And you reinforce it not by accepting the reality, you reinforce it by persuading people to overcome their prejudices and not make it policy. But the GRC system accepted the fact that, well, people vote according to their race, and therefore we have to have this system to make sure there's enough minority candidates in each parliament. And similarly for the SAP schools, it was inadvertently, because the basic premise for SAP schools is to make sure that in terms of language, the Chinese language is not lost as Singapore becomes more westernized. And there was a great pressure from the Chinese educated groups to make sure that Chinese language and values are not only sustained, but also enriched by continued learning and higher learning. And so you begin to segregate them according to their language. So it was something that worried Rajaratnam, because once you segregate people according to the language, then there was not much interaction between the different races. And that would undermine the whole quest for Singapore in Singapore, where people not only interact with one another, but they influence one another, they attend each other's festivals, they begin to adapt and adjust their festivals to the multiracial milieu, and they evolve their own identity as a special Singapore in Singapore, your own making. It's a nation of your own making. But to give an illustration of how discreet he was, he never made this public. He never made his disagreements public. It was not out of fear or anything. It was just because he was an honorable servant of the government, and he believed in collective responsibility. So if a decision is made in cabinet after he's voiced his disagreements, but the consensus is still that the policy should go ahead, Mr. Rajaratnam was not one of those who will agree in private and disagree in public. He is not only discreet, but responsible, and he wanted to make sure that whatever policy that is agreed upon and implemented, it will succeed to the extent that it is meant to improve Singapore's well-being. But of course, he voiced his disagreements behind doors, and according to those who have witnessed or overheard the disagreements with Lee Kuan Yew, it's widely known that he held it to the end. He held his disagreements, his views on these issues right to the end. And Mr. Lee Kuan Yew himself told me that they never persuaded each other.
Lee Kuan Yew has always dominated public perception and awareness of the old guard leaders. But as Lee Kuan Yew himself insisted, he was not a one-man show and depended on a good team. Do you think your book helps to paint a more complete picture of the old guard's collective efforts to build Singapore?
When I set out to write this book, it was not to paint a more complete picture of the old guard's collective efforts to build Singapore. It was really to give a complete picture of what Mr. Rajaratnam did to build Singapore. But if that helped to give a deeper understanding and a broader view of history of Singapore's struggles in the earlier years especially, then I am glad that this book would be useful. That said, much of what people know of Mr. Lee Kuan Yew today is based on the fact that Mr. Lee Kuan Yew was in power for the most years compared to the other founding leaders of Singapore. But Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, because he had a lot of interactions with the second generation of leaders, and not only the second, but also the third, he loomed large in the minds of many, including perhaps the existing leaders. And Mr. Lee Kuan Yew has written his own memoirs, and he's given countless interviews. Mr. Rajaratnam, despite being a great writer and a prolific columnist, he did not document his own achievements or his own legacy or his own policy formulations in as much detail. And because of that, people tend to conflate most of Singapore's major policies of the past with Mr. Lee Kuan Yew and Mr. Lee Kuan Yew alone. I think it's important at this stage in our history to take a proper measure, especially of Singapore's earlier years when everything hung in the balance, and give due credit to those who have themselves not only sacrificed their lives, but were willing to stake their lives on Singapore's survival. I think that's not only to be fair to history, but also to be fair to the individuals concerned. And that's why I say when I embarked on this project, I asked for the support of Mr. Lee, and he gave it straight away. And in fact, his email to me was that it is a worthwhile project. I think Mr. Lee would himself acknowledge, as you said, that it was not a one-man show. It's just that today in public imagination, he is given a role that is almost mythical. But they are all flesh and blood human beings trying to do their best in impossible situations. And I hope that those who read my biography of Mr. Rajaratnam get a sense that these are people who rose to the challenge despite themselves, despite their own doubts, despite their own fears, and managed to build a Singapore that succeeded beyond their dreams. And constantly, if you read their speeches, including Mr. Rajaratnam, their thoughts are always on the future generations. And therefore, when I wrote this book, it's dedicated to the current and future generations of Singapore, because I think it's important for them to understand not only the contributions of one man or the contributions of a collection of men, but basically the struggles, the sacrifices made, and the ideals and passion that drove these men to such heights. And if it's possible then, it's possible in the future as well. And may that example inspire generations to come.